Okay, great. Thank you, Amanda, and thanks everyone for joining today. I think it's been a really great webinar series that NIAX and the Forest Stewards Guilds have been hosting, so it's great to be here on a mid-August day to share with you. And I'm really happy today to be joined by Eric Hansen. We're going to be talking a bit about a particular case study of where we've worked on climate communications and integrated into an existing program. We'll touch a little bit on the landowner audience, on the role of foresters as messengers, and as Amanda said, hopefully have some time for discussion at the end. Eric, I'm really glad that you can be with us today, and I don't know if you wanted to offer any opening thoughts.
Sure, yeah, and thank you for the invitation and to be a part of this. So I was having a conversation earlier today actually with a logger, and he said something that I think is really relevant to what we're talking about today. And he said, in order for us to be able to have a functional society, there are 4 things that people need to be, and that is in this order: honest, humble, compassionate, and empathetic. And I think today, in particular, as we're talking about the role of foresters in this whole process, I think we need to focus first on those 2 things: being honest about what we know and what we don't know, and being humble about the things that we actually think we know, and realizing that there's a lot that we don't. My experience with this topic has been for nearly a decade now, and I think it's glad to see that there's so many people who are here and interested to hearing about this stuff. So thank you.
Great, thanks, Eric. And just to be sure, everybody can see the presentation and hear okay?
We're good.
Okay, great. Okay, so thinking about the big picture of climate communications and kind of the US perspective, the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication and George Mason University are a great resource for the latest data on public opinion. And so I thought we would take a look at that to start off. Considering that we're in the middle of a pandemic, we might think that concern about climate change is taking a back seat to much more other immediate concerns, and that might have diminished somewhat. But their research that came out in April 2020 found that a record-tying 73% of Americans think global warming is happening. And this is as high as this level of belief has ever been in their research. And 66% of folks think that global warming is affecting the weather. So that's somewhat encouraging for our work as we start off here. And taking a look at views on climate adaptation, which is our topic today. 55% of Americans say that they think that state and local governments should protect agriculture and public water supplies and protect public health from the effects of global warming. This research found that 4 in 10 think protecting forests should be a high priority. And if you add in those that think it should be a medium priority, that gets you up, above 70%. So again, those are promising results. So let's dive into some examples of working to reach specific audiences about climate change. And we're going to focus today on NEF's work in the Mascon Woods landscape, which covers northeastern Connecticut and south central Massachusetts. And we've had a sustained landowner outreach project here since around 2014. We joined with American Forest Foundation to road test outreach strategies that were at first related to sustainable forest management and conservation. And so we had built a strong partnership here with local partners and national partners as well, focused on more traditional landowner outreach before we began to incorporate the climate change messaging with funding from specific grants to do that. So as mentioned, our key local partner was the MassCon Sustainable Forest Partnership, and you can see them here on the map designated by the big arrow there. And this, is a 38-town region straddling the Connecticut-Massachusetts border. And we had a series of direct mail campaigns that we began to offer in 2014. They either offered information or the opportunity to meet with experts, which were both from the land trust community and also foresters. And so we were beginning to build a pipeline of engaged landowners in this region, and also contributing to conservation gains on the ground, considering that this is an important north-south wildlife corridor, which is going to become even more crucial as climate change continues to advance. There's also important remaining forest cores here, large and medium cores, so a lot of good potential for conservation. And so also to note that this map shows all of the approximately 42 regional conservation partnerships in New England, and MassCon being one of those. And basically the goal with these collaborative efforts is to really scale up our conservation potential, working together to think bigger picture in terms of funding different conservation deals and making more gains on the ground. And so NEF's work has really been looking at some key audiences that we need to work with successfully to achieve these goals, including woodland owners, foresters, and land trusts. And so the MassCon program kind of works with each of them. So this image is showing some information from the MassCon mapper, which the organization has their own conservation priorities, which we attempted to build into our outreach efforts. The red zones here are indicating the top 20% or so of the ecological priorities that the partnership identified. And we were able to integrate this into our landowner outreach and creating our mailing lists. Also, the Nature Conservancy has wonderful data sets, including their GIS data that indicates high terrestrial resilience. And so that was among the information that MassCon included as a priority. So we were actually targeting landowners whose properties fell within these zones. And we were aiming to reach people that owned at least 25 acres when we offered visits. So again, just to emphasize that our primary audience was family landowners in all of this outreach work. And I wanted to mention that as a result of this multi-year project, NEF has published a report late last year called From Engagement to Action. And it really focuses on this crucial audience of about 215,000 private New England family forest owners. And there's the breakdown there for the 2 states that we were working in. And these owners of undeveloped lands, whether they're in conservation now or not, are going to be crucial in deciding the future of our forests. And are we going to be able to manage with climate solutions in mind, both for storing more carbon and promoting resilience, which is going to be a precursor, in order to successfully provide climate solutions from our forests. Also, just to mention that some of the report conclusions include the importance of investing in proactive and sustained outreach to landowners. And we think it's really important to kind of pair the power of our technology and being able to use these maps to identify ecological priorities, but also thinking about kind of the art of understanding human behavior and applying that knowledge to our social marketing and our messaging, and really motivating landowners to make wise decisions about their land with our support. Okay, so if you want to engage your audience in climate change action, how do you get started with that? And we wanted to really focus today on some advice that comes from the Land Trust Alliance that worked with a small group of us from the Massachusetts Ecosystem Climate Adaptation Network to come up with this guidance. And it is research-based, and I believe there was a link shared in the resources page where you can dig in and actually see some of the source material for this guidance. But I wanted to give a shout out to Bridget McDonald, who does communications with the Fish and Wildlife Service, and Megan Gukian at the UMass Environmental Decision Making Lab. And they really dug in to help create these resources. There's also some additional supplementary material that includes kind of an analysis of actual communications pieces, so you can see examples of each of these themes represented there, and pros and cons of different ways of approaching it. Okay, so we're going to kind of dive through one by one on these. So the first piece of advice is to lead with politically neutral messages. And so when it comes to polarizing issues like climate change, we find that people tend to move to their default ideology, or their worldview that kind of guides everything in their life. And they're less likely to be swayed by facts or statistics in these cases. But we know that conservation isn't really all that controversial. Many landowners care deeply about wildlife habitat. We know that forests provide clean air and water in order to make our communities healthy. So there are a lot of themes that we can really focus on to start the conversation. And so these images here are the covers of one of our direct mail campaigns in MassCon. And you can see, it's a little tough to read all of them, but at least on the cover, we're not mentioning climate change or global warming anywhere here in this opening text. So, people don't need to believe in that concept in order to respond to us. And, we don't want to take them out of the running when we're just first trying to get to know them. And the inside text kind of delves a little bit more into promoting forest health and resilience and some of the impacts that they might be seeing. You can see here that the Healthy Woods theme actually had the greatest number of responders in this particular series. And we were cognizant at the time that the gypsy moth outbreak was underway in our region in Massachusetts and Connecticut. And people were very worried about that. So, we didn't shy away from that. It was another opportunity to help people to respond and to learn more. But we also, touched on other messages. And just to clarify, each landowner got each of these postcards. It was a series of 3, basically over the course of 6 weeks. And there's a response card that they can fill out. It's postage paid, and they just drop that in the mail to respond. Okay. So I wanted to turn it over to Eric here, and I wanted to explain that Eric is one of a pretty small core of about a half dozen foresters who participated with this project, and they actually went out and met with the landowners once we received the response. And I wanted to check in with Eric about this idea of leading with politically neutral messages and kind of starting the conversation with folks.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And there was a part of me, and I don't know if this was on purpose or not, but when I went out to do these walks originally, I kind of assumed, for better or worse, that most of these people were already on board with the concept of the fact that climate change is real, and that they were interested in how they can manage their woods to help them be more resilient with that in mind. So that said, on all the visits that I've done, which, Lisa, I'm not exactly sure how many, but half a dozen or a dozen, something like this. So it's quite a few. It came up every time, and there was really no issues with that. It was really helpful, I found, to be able to go through the written checklist that we got beforehand, so that basically it wasn't necessarily coming directly from me, but from some paperwork that I was filling out, getting information from them about their property first, and then kind of diving into that afterwards. Outside of this project, and I think we're going to talk more about this later, but I have had some experiences with people who were very much not on board with the concept of climate change. And I'll give a couple anecdotes a little bit later on about how I've dealt with those situations.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so the second piece of advice is to find trusted spokespeople to deliver your message. And in the MassCon project, we were really working to equip foresters to kind of become our adaptation messengers. And so through our first grant from the Wildlife Conservation Society, we developed this suite of communications materials, and they're pictured here. There's a couple of fact sheets. The one on the left was directed at foresters and land managers, kind of giving them a synthesized guide to the science applied to the southern New England landscape. The one on the right was a landowner facing fact sheet, sort of written specifically for that audience, and explaining the themes to them. And then there's this checklist tool, which we'll spend a little bit more time on later, and that Eric mentioned. But the idea here was for this tool to be used during the site visit for the foresters to fill out about 3 to 5 of the most important climate vulnerabilities that, in their judgment, that they were seeing at that particular site. And it's been a great tool that allows us to, bring these themes up at the time with the landowner while they're walking in the woods, and then also to follow up later with a copy of this checklist as we kind of check back with the landowners and see if we can support them to take next steps, or have you thought about this and are you interested in moving forward on taking any of these actions. So I also wanted to mention here that there was some challenges though in deciding that we were going to have foresters kind of be our messenger group. We've early research in the MassCon project, and we did some surveys of the landowners in that region to kind of get a better idea of where they were coming from. Did find that less than 25% of them worked with the forester, though nearly a half of them had harvested timber. So we knew that, that was sort of a challenge for us. Also, one of our earlier campaigns had a relatively low response rate for a forester visit. And so we worked to try to address that in some of our later campaigns and messaging. And, we wanted to explain what a forester does, because not every landowner and a lot of people in the community don't actually understand that. What's the difference between a logger, the person who comes out and cuts the trees, and they don't necessarily understand that a forester can really be an advocate for them as a landowner. So we worked on that with quotes from experienced landowners who could kind of, share that experience. And, similar to hiring an accountant to work on your taxes, sometimes you need an expert, to give you on the ground advice. Okay. So again, just to emphasize that we had to focus on this secondary audience as well of the practicing foresters, both to provide advice on integrating climate change into the good work that they're already doing, and also kind of this communications piece. So we did work with NIAX to host several training sessions for foresters in the region. And as you all know, probably Maria and the shop at NIAX do great work in providing educational forums, both online and in person, for this kind of training, back when we can do in-person meetings. Okay. So the third theme in terms of communications advice is focusing on local responses, and rather than causes, and trying to find common ground with your audience. And here I wanted to turn it over to Eric to kind of share some of his insights from actually meeting with folks on their properties.
Thanks. So this is kind of where rubber meets the road in terms of a lot of these conversations. And realistically, this applies to, that finding common ground theme applies to almost anything that you're going to be talking about with landowners or really any other people about whatever. And so I want to make a couple things clear. First of all, I am not claiming to be an expert about either climate change or how to talk about it. I am very happy to have the opportunity here today to help bring along the conversation and share some of my experiences, and hopefully everybody can learn a little something from everybody else here today. In terms of the common ground theme and focusing on local impacts, that is what I've found to be the most engaging for people, when you can bring them to a site or just have them look out their window and see that their trees have been defoliated, see that there has been some more substantial storms than normal, and they're experiencing impacts either to their roads or their woods roads. Walking around people in their woods in January and starting to see the red maples breaking bud, those are very clear and fairly obvious signs that things are changing. And even for people who aren't necessarily on board with the concept of climate change, they can kind of understand that weird things are going on. And so to me, part of the cool thing about this, and Lisa mentioned this earlier, is that a lot of what we're recommending for on-the-ground actions to make your forest more resilient and to a certain extent to help with adaptation to climate change, because realistically we don't know what that is, but a lot of the practices that we recommend are just general good forestry practices anyway. This gives, the concept of climate change gives another way to reach certain people. And frankly, as a forester, if you're able to talk about this stuff with some level of knowledge, but again, that honesty about what you know and what you don't know, I think that's really helpful in being able to engage people who aren't necessarily interested in what you know about timber or the traditional forestry pursuits. And it's very similar to what a lot of you have probably experienced thus far. And I saw was another presentation earlier this summer with things like forests and foresters and forestry for the birds, and exemplary forestry that New England Forestry Foundation talks about. So being able to show people on their own woodlots things that are changing is really critical. And although when I'm talking about this, thinking about kind of big picture stuff, bring it down to their property level, and irrespective of whether or not their forest, big or little as it may be, is going to have an impact globally. We point out things that they can do to improve the health and resilience of their own forest, which I think means something to most people that I've interacted with. Lisa, was there anything else you wanted to add on this slide?
Yeah, I guess just, are there specific examples of this? I know that some of the landowners that we've had workshops with, they really remember like that year, I think it was 2011, when we had the snowstorm really early in like around Halloween, and there was still leaves on the trees, so there was a lot of broken branches, and power was out for days, like we kind of just went through with that tropical storm. So people tend to remember those kind of events, and I wondered if any of that kind of example comes up maybe in your meetings with folks.
So there are some specific things, including tornadoes that have happened recently, and some more general things. And the general things that most people will agree to, irrespective of where they're coming from, is that we get hotter summers, milder winters, and when it rains, it pours. So those three things I've found that almost anybody who lives around here and has experienced the weather, irrespective of climate, has just experienced weather, they're seeing in their own lives. I can't say for sure, obviously, whether or not the recent outbreaks of gypsy moth have anything to do with climate, because obviously that's been happening for a long time now, but it was coupled with drought, which is one of the weather impacts that we are predicted to see much more of.
Right, and that fungus in the spring that usually kind of counteracts the gypsy moth, probably we didn't have much rain, I think, that year in that time period. So it may have been an interaction. Yeah,
I'm glad you brought that up. And there is one other thing that I've been noticing this year. This is the second mild, really mild winter we have had in a row down here in southern New England, and I am seeing much more hemlock woolly adelgid on the hemlocks in the woods this year than I have over the last 10 years or so. And again, I don't know if there's a direct correlation, but I think there probably is some relationship there.
Okay, great. And I wanted to follow up too on something you said there, Eric, that I meant to say earlier. We're kind of showing MassCon what practices that we happen to use related to this communications advice, but I wanted to make clear that the guidance wasn't there in the early years of our project, and it's not like we had all the answers or anything. We just kind of stumbled into these approaches, and this project started as a pilot project, and it was certainly very much kind of experimenting with different tactics, and it was very iterative. We would learn from our successes and our failures. So I just wanted to mention that we're not claiming that we had all the answers here at all either. So okay, so I think we can move on, and just to touch again on the Yale research was very helpful in kind of the framing of our work early in the program and incorporating climate change themes, because there's Six Americas work, which probably many of you have heard of, kind of segments the U.S. population in terms of their understanding and belief in global warming on this continuum from alarmed on the left to dismissive on the right. And this was helpful in thinking through the fact that the landowners that we were going to be meeting with through the program were probably going to fall somewhere along this continuum. And you can think about your time and probably arguing with people on the far right who are just not willing to listen to the idea of climate change at all. It might be a waste of your time, but there's a whole lot of people, upwards of around 75% on the other end of the spectrum that are probably at least going to be willing to listen and perhaps open to learning more. So that was helpful. And then the last two themes in terms of the climate communications advice kind of just underscore basic good communications principles. So the fourth one is avoiding technical jargon and keeping it simple. And the example of this was kind of the checklist that we created, which was pulled from the science guidance from NIACS. They have the menu of adaptation strategies and approaches, which is a much longer list and more complete list of practices related to climate adaptation. And so we kind of boiled that down into a smaller group, and also tried to apply the language that landowners use in keeping it real simple. So for example, there was words like protecting hydrology and soils and nutrient cycling, that kind of thing. And that just became, protecting soils and waters on your land. So that kind of wording. And Eric, did you have something you wanted to share on this one?
I do actually, and it's two things. First of all, and again, this is my experience. So it seems to have worked for me, but it might not work for everybody. What I do when I'm talking with people about this kind of stuff, because it is fairly complicated, is I don't necessarily immediately jump into the technical jargon, but as I'm walking with people, especially out in the woods, I do start to introduce some more complicated words and topics. And what I try to do is just make sure to regularly check in with them to make sure that they understand the words that I'm talking about. And if they don't, we bring it back down to where they do, because I want to make sure when I'm talking and working with people that A, they're comfortable with what we're talking about, but B, they get some sort of knowledge that I at least think I have as well. So I don't necessarily completely shy away from the jargon. The other thing that I wanted to mention, and I think this could have been potentially more applicable to the first slide you showed with the politically charged messages, but I'll say it now just so I don't forget again, is there have been a couple of instances where I have thought that I had known my audience and brought up the concept of climate change beforehand, and as it turns out, I did not know my audience, and I got a fairly aggressive response back that basically climate change doesn't exist, and you know, I don't want to hear about that. And so my response at the time, this was all via email, was okay. And this was 3 years ago now. Later on, I did actually end up having a conversation with the person over the phone as opposed to via email. And I found that to be very useful for a variety of reasons, including being able to talk about the things that I mentioned before and that Lisa mentioned, that a lot of the things that we would be doing and talking about, we'd be doing and talking about anyway. You know, whether that is making sure that soil and water are taken care of, making sure that you have diverse species, making sure that your roads are in the right places, making sure you have diverse age classes, all the kinds of things that foresters would normally talk about. And that helped to kind of bring us back to being on the same page. And this is, again, is 3 years ago. I'm still working with the person, but we haven't had a conversation about climate change since. So we kind of agreed to disagree, but move forward with the things on his property that, you know, both meant something to us, albeit perhaps for different reasons.
Great.
I think that's enough for that.
Okay. All right. So moving on to the last piece of communications advice is using photos to tell a story. They really advise showing people's faces, like looking at the camera, and doing desired actions. And of course, I think we all know that, you know, a charismatic wildlife also make great photos that are compelling and draw people in to your topic. So these are a couple of postcards from our latest visit offer in 2018. And we've completed over 100 of these parcel level visits now, covering around 8,500 acres in that two-state MassCon area. And Eric, I think you had something quick you wanted to add here.
Just really quick, whenever I do management plans, I try to illustrate as much as I can with pictures, because that seems to really resonate with people, whether it's for climate adaptation purposes or just general explanation of forestry principles.
Great. Okay, so wanted to shift here at the time we have left, which we're kind of running short on our presentation time, but we have maybe just a couple minutes to touch on this. You know, not only we're trying to engage people to even start in the conversation and thinking about their land and adaptation and management themes there. We're also trying to help support them to move ahead and take action on the recommendations. So this slide here is showing again some more of the detailed practices that are on that, considerations for your woodlot checklist that the foresters used in the visits in this program. And wanted to mention here that the forest ecosystem adaptation work, now being called Forest Can, I think, a climate adaptation network work group, is kind of taking a closer look at these practices from the checklist, which have been kind of, you know, used and recycled and built on in a few of the other states in New England, but taking a look at them and thinking about whether they fall into the categories of no regrets or low regrets practices in terms of climate change. And if there's questions about that, I think Maria's on and she might be able to address that topic. But so now this is showing one example actually of the recommendations from the checklist from a forester visit. And Eric actually did this visit, has been working with these very active landowners in Woodstock, Connecticut in the recent years. So I wondered if he could spend just a minute or two sharing some examples from that project.
Sure. And I know we're running short on time, so I'll make this relatively quick. But these people are pretty incredible landowners, and I know not everybody gets a chance to work with people like this, so I'm very appreciative to have that opportunity. But they have moved forward with a lot of the recommendations that came out of the checklist and subsequent forest management plan that was helped paid for by NRCS. And they actually did end up doing some small cuttings for to promote woodcock habitat, and they did some thinnings for a variety of reasons. One important thing that I want to bring up right now, particularly as it relates to NRCS related stuff, is NRCS has very compressed windows of time within which you're able to do some practices, specifically tree cutting, to avoid conflicts with breeding birds and in some cases bats. Usually that means wintertime. On this particular site, and actually on several sites that I'm working on throughout the state, that has become kind of an issue over the last several years because, again, as I mentioned earlier, we're having much milder winters, which means we don't get the freezes and the frozen soils that we used to get, which makes working during that time period much more complicated and perhaps even not advisable. So that is something moving forward that may end up being an issue for some of you who work with that program and private landowners.
Okay, great. And so just to emphasize, as Eric mentioned, you know, part of our efforts have been helping to refer folks who had these forester visits to get funding if they don't have a management plan to go ahead and work with the forester to create one, and also pursuing grants that are available in the region, like through RCPP programs, which happen to be the case in MassCon, or traditional cost share, as Eric was saying. And then it's sort of this series of events, you know, folks that do get engaged and actually take action on their land can hopefully then kind of become ambassadors who can share their experience with other landowners. And so we've had a series of woodland walks we've been able to host with the partnership. And Eric has led some of those walks. We've done it in the fall for several years now with that Woodstock property we were talking about. And people love seeing their wildlife cams, the footage from them on Facebook, and we get great turnout every year for that walk. And then to mention that working with NIACS, they of course have the Adaptation Workbook, which is a wonderful planning resource for assessing vulnerability. And they have created this network of demonstration sites, and some of our you know, places we've talked about in MassCon are part of that network. One of those demo sites is the Norcross Wildlife Sanctuary, which is one of our first partner sites, about 8,000 acres again in that border region. They were able to conduct a couple of timber harvests with the advice of NIACS, and so we had harvest and habitat walks at those sites. And lastly, we have this sort of a slightly different model of demo site in a different setting, Keeney Park in Hartford, which is an urban park, and a lot of stakeholders involved there. And very excited that Eric is working with us on the adaptation workbook for this site in partnership with the state of Connecticut DEEP and the city of Hartford. And Eric, if you had a couple comments you wanted to add here.
Sure. This is a really, really cool and interesting site with a fascinating history, including the fact that it was planned by Frederick Law Olmsted. And there's a series of old carriage roads that still exist throughout the interior, as well as a bunch of human-made vernal pools with channels all throughout. So for this one, because it was so complicated, much of what we tried to think about during the vulnerability assessments and the management planning process for climate change adaptation was kind of bringing things back to basics again with soil and water quality, decreasing invasive plants where possible, maintaining softwood cover, and increasing diversity of species of regeneration in the understory. And there's going to be the possibility for doing some actual demonstrations of silvicultural practices there that are going to be potentially on the horizon. There's one really interesting thing there that I noticed that I think might be worth talking about for just a second, and which that is something that I haven't seen elsewhere in Connecticut, but it is a fair amount of a species called umbrella magnolia. And the only reason I bring that up is if you have projects that you're working on where the landowner or you, if you happen to be the landowner, are interested in doing some experimental things, if you have the ability to do some kind of progressive plantings for species that are generally more southerly, if you have the right conditions for it, and if you think that they will not act as an invasive, that might be a cool and interesting thing to think about doing.
Okay, great. And I think, well, here's a page with some resources, again, links to the various materials we've talked about today. And I believe Maria's got a great list that she's going to share with you all. So, and again, just to note, Yale has other resources that we didn't have time to delve into, but you can even look up by county or congressional district on, you know, people's perceptions in those areas. And I think that wraps up our presentation piece. So.
Great, thank you so much, Lisa and Eric. What I love about this presentation, it's kind of like silviculture, which is an art and a science. So we've gotten, you know, Lisa has put together a lot of the slides with kind of a good scientific categorization of how do you communicate with landowners about climate change, a very complex topic. And Eric has brought a lot of the art to it, and you can't have complete climate change communication without the art and the science. So I really appreciate both of your sharing this perspective the way you have. We had some questions come into the chat box, but I think Maria has addressed them. And just as a reminder to everybody, all the resources that Lisa and Eric have listed are on the NIAX website, so you can find them there. What I would love to do now actually is to segue into your comments. So for folks that received the little questionnaire, we had some interesting responses to the question about, well, there's two questions. What is the most challenging aspect of talking about climate change is the first one. And so we have some responses. And Lisa, if you don't mind, I'd like to share. I'm going to steal the floor back.
Sure.
Okay. So I'm going to show what our responses were. So what I saw, or what we were seeing in response to that question, what is the most challenging aspect of talking about climate change? And I would love if you have thoughts, if you want to type them into the chat box, does this resonate with you? So challenging aspects, having to simplify a complex technical problem and then relay information in an understandable, non-confrontational way. The scope of the topic is so encompassing. Focusing on a narrow aspect of it can prove challenging. So the scope of it is a challenge. In the private landowner context, how do you explain to a landowner what can such a small state or piece of land contribute to such a large problem? so another challenge. Figuring out people's values and how to best connect with them on this politicized topic. Figuring out tangible ways they can act and balancing urgency with sensitivity to the topic. And again, if you've got your chat window open, I would love to hear responses. Does this resonate with you? Yes? No? You have a quick story you want to share? While you're typing in the chat window, or if you have questions or comments in the chat window, there's a few more responses that were worth sharing, and these echo some of the themes that Eric and Lisa shared in their presentation. The term climate change itself, and that has been framed as something to believe in, as we've discussed. It's become a political issue somehow, which makes it difficult to discuss rationally. What's rational about politics these days? Coming up with consistent talking points that I can use when talking with forest landowners who span a broad spectrum regarding climate change. So talking points, and there are some tools that are out there. And last but not least, coming up with things to say that are not depressing. So if this resonates with you, I would love to hear from you in the chat box, and I'm working on these Zoom windows. So, and if you have comments as well as questions, I'd love to hear them. Let's see. So Jennifer says, I can relate to all of these challenges. Strategic framing has helped me immensely, and she shared a resource there, www.nnocci.org. And Dominique shares, yes, it definitely resonates. To know your audience is the most important. Level of education, political affiliation, vulnerability of their woodlot, really, really great. Thank you. I know there are a lot of you out there, so please share. Karen says, especially, how can a small property contribute to such a large issue? So yeah, Karen, with your long career in extension, I'm sure you came across that one a lot. Don't worry, we have a solution slide. So, and Dominique added, doom and gloom approach is really not the way to go, but it's difficult to find documented success stories. So, well, we do have some of those, hopefully in the demonstration forest areas and some of what Lisa shared, but maybe we should, in part 2 of this webinar, maybe we can talk about some of the communication success stories in addition to the actual demonstration and adaptation successes. Great. Allie says, yes, all of these. I'll also add the time frame of climate change. Really good point. Some impacts will be gradually changing. Others might occur abruptly. How do we pair these with typical forest management plans that are for 10 or 20 years? Yeah. So does anybody have any comments or suggestions? Or Eric, what do you think? How do you pair climate change impacts with a forest management plan that's for 10 or 20 years?
So I will reiterate that I'm not necessarily an expert on this, but I will certainly give you my opinion. There are the immediate effects that we seem to be seeing in terms of the weather, but my experience tells me that the effects of climate change are really going to be more gradual than 10 or 20 years. So one management plan cycle, which generally for us is 10 years, is probably not going to be enough time for major shifts to happen. That said, whenever I do a management plan for somebody, I tell them that none of this stuff is set in stone and that it is intended to be a guide and needs to be a living document. And the key is monitoring and engagement.
Those are great reminders. Yeah, thank you, Eric. Yeah, FMPs should be living documents. We don't have to address all of climate change with one FMP on a landowner's property. We have a couple more comments on this. I'm going to, while I read the last comments, I'll let you read ahead on the recommendations, so our solution slides. So just on the follow-up for the last slide, Stephen says, oops, everything's jumping around. Stephen says, the reality is that there's a lot landowners can do. This will motivate landowners. Thank you for sharing that. Peter says, yes, this resonates. Agree with Eric's assessment that good forestry is not different from climate change forestry, which can take the edge off of some situations and be a window into interactions with folks leery of forestry but interested in climate change. So sort of a double-edged sword there. Jennifer adds, I do 1-hour webinars on strategic framing for climate change communications, which address most of, if not all of, the challenges mentioned. happy to do one of those for those interested. So email Jennifer West in Rhode Island. She shared her email. Wonderful, thank you. And Dominique also shared, the problem with success stories is, will it continue to be successful? As climate change continues and the challenges increase, and temperatures and CO2 increase. So it is a problem, but there's also living in the moment. Stephen mentions some landowners may get ahead of the science. Thus, they may want to plant trees from southern latitudes, but we need to be careful so that we're not planting off-site trees that do poorly for health and resilience. Jeff asks, and we're going to segue into the kind of the solution slides here. But he asks, how do we as resource professionals build trust with multiple publics in order for society to continue to allow us to manage for forest adaptation? That's a great question. And with that, I'm going to just briefly read through these quotes. I will mention we will stop at the top of the hour to let people jump off, but we're happy to keep questions, keep the discussion going for a few minutes afterwards. So let me just dive into these slides. The recommendations you would like to offer on effective ways to talk about climate change, and these came from you, our registrants. So listen, listen, listen. Begin the conversation with commonalities, not differences. Use a common sense approach, doing things that make sense monetarily or ecologically, regardless of climate change. Talk about weather events they've experienced, trends in the hottest days, low snow, more mud, variability. Isn't the weather weird? Without mentioning climate change. Talk about future planning, investing in a range of options, preparing for the worst. Those are some good common sense themes that can resonate. But I also feel like I shouldn't have to conceal the term climate change. So hopefully you can find a good way to get there. A few other recommendations. Identify a person's values as a way to connect and engage with them. Find things that are relatable to connect climate change from the perspective of the person you're engaging with. Talk about things people can do that ultimately have an effect on reducing climate change impacts, not focusing on the topic itself in terms of causes and future results, or even climate change in general, but in other words, focus on concrete actions and de-emphasize the gloom and doom predictions, and even focus on the use of the words climate change. So there's some good solutions there. In the couple minutes we have left, I'd love to see if you have thoughts, additional recommendations that these might spur, other suggestions that you might have. Please put those in the chat window. We have a couple minutes to address those before we have to wrap up, or the official wrap up. So we'll see what you got in the chat window.
Amanda?
Yes.
Hi, it's Lisa. I did want to just briefly mention too, hearkening back to one of the questions that was asked in the preliminary materials, about whether folks talk about climate change in their personal lives. And I did want to share this stat from the Yale program too, that their research that came out this year finds that 64% of Americans say they rarely or never discuss global warming with family and friends. And only 22% say they hear people they know talk about the topic like on a monthly basis. So it's almost like, is this still a taboo topic? And, it does seem like it's going to be hard to build consensus on, the changes that we need, like society and economy wide, if we're afraid to talk about it. So I guess I would say, don't be afraid to talk about it, and don't apologize for facts, even as you're trying to gauge, how to engage, how to speak productively with people.
Yeah, communicating about climate change is an art and a science, indeed. Well, we are a minute before the top of the hour, and I'm sure people agree that these messages resonate, and I'm sure there are more good ideas, but nobody's typing them in the chat box at the moment. So while we're a minute before the top of the hour, I'll just pause and thank our speakers officially. And again, folks are welcome to stay on after the top of the hour. I should say to everybody, if you are looking for SAF credits, then I just put a link into the chat window to a certificate of credit assignment. So you can keep that in your records, and we are going to submit a list of all the registrants for today, or all the participants to SAF for your forestry licensing credit record. Again, please feel free to stick around for a couple minutes after the top and continue your questions and thoughts and recommendations on effective ways to communicate about climate change. But please join me in a virtual huge thank you to Lisa, to Eric, to Maria, and also to Leonora behind the scenes who really put this whole thing together. So thanks, everybody. Thank you to our presenters so much for sharing your thoughts and your wisdom. Yay! you do the virtual applause hands, but thank you. And again, if folks have questions, you're welcome to stick around, questions or comments. We'll stay on for a couple minutes. So thanks everybody. This is a really, really enriching webinar. And again, check out the website on the NIACS website with the links that Maria put very early in the chat box, and all these nice resources that Lisa and Eric have laid out can be found there in hyperlinks. So thank you, thank you, thank you. We're getting a lot of thank yous into the chat window. No additional comments on climate change communication, but Ali said, seems like this could be a standalone seminar series. Just a thought. If you're volunteering to be part of it, Ali, we'll give you a call. Sorry, go ahead, Eric.
I just had one other example of something that I wanted to mention before I forgot, and that is I had another interaction with somebody, and at first I thought it wasn't going to go well because they said to me, this is a client of mine, do you really believe in climate change, meaning that they didn't? And that was kind of the beginning of a conversation, and it allowed me to do what we were talking about before, to bring the things that they have experienced about the weather and about their property home to them. And I'm not sure that their mind was changed at all during the course of that conversation. But you know, I suppose I had the option to say, you know, kind of be wishy-washy about it, but I said, yes, I do, and here's why. You know, their face said, oh, interesting. But like I said, I don't know if at the end of the conversation there was any difference. But when you get that opportunity, or I guess I say, when and if you get that opportunity, it would be a good thing to try to engage with that, although it's not necessarily easy.
Great, thank you, Eric. Well, I think we can probably safely wrap up now. So thanks again to all of our presenters for being part of this and sharing these resources. And maybe we'll do a part 2 and a part 3 and further on with climate change communication. Everybody out there, stay safe, and we'll hope to see you in the woods again someday soon. So thanks for joining us.
Great, thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.